Central to much recent work in both anthropology and history is the concept of agency. This essay examines some problems with this concept that arises when we look for it across historical and ethnographic contexts. The study focuses on how agency is expressed and in differences among the powers that people impute to spoken words and the kinds of subjects to which they attribute the authorship of words. In this article, I want in particular to show how attention to the intersections between speech practices and speakers' beliefs about language can shed light on the historical and cultural worlds in which those speakers act. The problem of agency is often raised by anthropologists and historians in the effort to be inclusive, to take account of all the players in the game. Furthermore, the question of agency increasingly reflects an ethical imperative. As Talal Asad has recently remarked, the doctrine of action has become essential to our recognition of other people's humanity. The anthropologist's quest for local agency is often portrayed as an antidote to earlier assumptions about tradition-bound natives and timeless structures, or to triumphalist narratives of empire and modernity. For many scholars, then, to understand history, or indeed simply to understand others, require us to think about agency. Moreover, to think about agency seems to demand an account of the conscious agent. But in order to be truly conscious, one might summarize that agent must be conscious of the fact of agency itself. An agent, by this view, would seem to be a subject that knows itself to possess agency. Such self-knowledge seems to be demanded, at least, by any description of action that would separate intended from unintended consequences and would take into consideration what actors themselves expect of other actors as they guide their own actions. Yet, if the particular forms and objects of consciousness are historical and cultural products, so too must be the concept of agency that mediates the agent's self-consciousness. To seek out agency, then, includes looking for the historical construction of the idea of agency itself. In doing so, I want to suggest that we encounter a central dilemma for anthropology. However much we may want to take seriously other people's self-consciousness, we cannot assume in advance that it will coincide with what we might take to be a convincing account of their actions and the consequences that follow from them. This is a consequence of the inseparability of people's self-understanding from the historical specificity of the concrete practices and semiotic forms in which it is embedded. Moreover, as I will suggest, that this might pose dilemmas for us arises in part out of some half-acknowledged sources in European intellectual, moral, and even theological history. The quest for agency seems to be tacitly informed by the humanist assumption that self-transformation is not only a central fact of history, but also a good that exceeds local systems of value. My interest here is in how people understand agency, and I mean to ask to what kind of subject do they think that agency properly belongs. In particular, I will take language both as a set of practices and as an object of reflection to be an especially useful source of insight. There are both theoretical and ethnographically specific reasons to look at agency by way of language. For one thing, The semiotically and pragmatically complex character of language is such that speakers can refer to explicit beliefs about action, while their speech practices embody tacit and possibly divergent assumptions about the nature of action. In addition, as I will discuss further below, both the ancestral ritualists and Christians in the colonial encounter I describe here place special weight on the powers and forms of language. Since language is both intimately bound with the subjectivity of its speakers and consists of linguistic forms and pragmatic conventions not fully of their own making, it is more than simply one medium of action among others. Although much of what I have to say applies to the speech of everyday conversation, the discussion here is restricted to words addressed to the spirit world. In the special but highly valued gender of prayer, if I were to give a thorough discussion of agency and language, I would have to pay close attention to the tacit understandings embedded in everything, from legal institutions to gossip to linguistic structure. In this article, however, my focus is narrower. I will look primarily at how people address invisible spirits, how they talk about the powers and values of the speech with which they do so, and what the implications are for the presumed nature of the persons who do the speaking. This essay focuses on the encounter between Dutch Calvinist missionaries, their converts, and unconverted ancestral ritualists on the Indonesian island of Sumba over the period from the arrival of the first Dutch residents at the beginning of this century to my most recent visit in 1993. My concern with missionization has several purposes. First, one might reasonably argue that the high value that Protestant conversion places on human power of self-transformation contributes to, or shares in, the defining feature of Euro-American views of modernity. That is, modernity can be characterized in part as bearing a vision of the world as potentially open to transformation from within. Historians may differ on the part Protestantism has played in the genesis of this vision, but certainly Protestant conversion provides a clear and influential model of the powers of transformation of both persons and society. More specifically, religious conversion was one of the chief problems worrying Sudanese at the time of my fieldwork. Their memories of colonialism, perceptions of what they call modernity, and interactions with the Indonesian state are dominated by the experience of religious change. Moreover, over the course of this century, missionary activity and religious conversion have been a constant inducement to self-revelation and reflection. Missionization demands an enormous amount of talk, as preachers, converts, and the unconverted are compelled to explain themselves to others, to explain others to themselves, and even to explain themselves to themselves. The question of how correctly to understand and locate agency animates, I will argue, some of the most fraught debates of the missionary encounter. The possession of agency is a defining feature by which missionaries distinguish subject from objects, and ontological distinctions with practical entailments both for morality and political economy. In particular, in Dutch eyes, It is the pagan's inappropriate ascription of agency to non-human subjects which underlies the dangerous errors known under the condemnatory label of fetishism. Moreover, I suggest that although the theological supports behind the word fetishism may have faded from the academic scene, much of our contemporary talk about agency continues to incorporate some of the assumptions about authenticity and liberation found in Christian discourse about paganism. As William Pitts has pointed out, talk about fetishism, whether religious, Marxist, or Freudian, arises in the encounter between an observer and some sort of other. To impute fetishism to others is to set in motion a comparison, as an observer recognizes that someone else is attributing false value to objects. In Pete's words, the fetish is situated in the space of cultural revolution as the place where the truth of the objects as fetish is revealed. It is this view of fetishism that interests me here. To speak of fetishism is by implication to assert that one views the desires and acts of others with a clear eye. Moreover, it is with the historicizing eye, one from which the scales have fallen. It is thus no accident that fetish discourse commonly attends narratives of modernity. The discourse of fetishism, in its several varieties, is concerned in part with the true distinction between subjects and objects. This is evident in the colonial and post-colonial encounter between Dutch Calvinists and ancestral ritualists, whom I will call Marapu followers, using the word for ancestral spirits, on Sumba. Over the course of this century, both historical circumstances and theological beliefs were such that the Dutch Calvinists were not in a position to force Sumbonese to convert and had to rely heavily on persuasion, even in the heyday of Dutch colonial power. The unconverted were in turn increasingly prompted to talk back, something that has continually put me in the midst of long and animated discussions. Much of this talk, for which I draw here mostly on Dutch writings of the colonial late colonial period, with some reference to my own more recent conversations, concerns the proper nature of the human subject. Viewed as a precipitate of the encounter itself, the discourse of fetishism provides a glimpse of the process by which the character of subject and object are constructed or challenged. For example, in 1909, the recently arrived Dutch missionary Wielanga wrote from his outpost in Sumba, "The primitives confound that which is a fruit of the imagination with reality, the objective with the subjective, the outer phenomena with their own spirit life." Wielanga drew here the commonplace distinction between inner and outer, immaterial and material. But the issue here is not simply a question of knowledge and error. Talk about fetishism is especially concerned about the misattribution of agency, responsibility, and desires to objects, to what the observer knows to be mere dead matter. Moreover, what seems to lend to the imputation of fetishism its extra charge is the sense that others are not only mistaken, but that their error is both seductive and dangerous. By ascribing agency to things that in truth lack it, they thereby deny, perhaps even rob, the agency of those who properly possess it, whether they are humans, God, or both. For this reason, The missionaries' work of demystification entails liberation, restoring to natives the agency which they have given away. Bringing others to true consciousness, in this view, is a critical step in their real development as agents, a logic whose echoes we can still hear in the ethical concerns of contemporary anthropology. In Sumba, the question of agency arose in the context of a brief colonial intervention in the first half of this century, an intervention that in practice was largely carried out as part of the project of missionaries, an ontological and moral reordering of the word. Despite the efforts of Willenga and his colleagues, however, a significant majority of Sumbanese remained Marapu followers until quite recently. At the time of my most recent conversations on Sumba, the debates between Christians and Marapu followers were still being carried out with some heat. For reasons that will become apparent shortly, much of the debate about agency and fetishism dwells on the proper use of language in dealings with the spirit word. Although it is important in both Marapu and Protestant worship, speech plays quite distinct roles in the two sets of religious practices. According to differing assumptions about the agency of speakers and hearers, manifest in questions of authorship and voice. The words that should emanate from the sincere individual speaker in Protestant prayer contrast to the highly formal and supposedly fixed canon of couplets used in Sambanese oratory and Marapu ritual. Most Sambanese place enormous value on ritual speech, which they accept as having been handed down unchanged from the ancestors. The value, efficacy, and authority of Sambanese ritual speech lie to an important degree in its formal characteristics. Many of these characteristics promote the textual dimension of language, those aspects of language that are most detachable from particular speakers and the immediate social, temporal, and physical context of speaking. By doing so, they help impart to speech and its speakers the authority of an ancestral medium that arises far from the here and now. To speak in this medium is to display one's detachment from personal and factional interests. Full command of ritual speech is in performance, indexes the speaker's legitimacy as someone who has received words by a series of links over the generation back to their primordial originators. Ultimately, ritual speech also enables its users to lay claim to a social identity that transcends the spatial and temporal limits of the individual mortal body. The value of these ritual couplets lies to an important degree in their capacity to portray the speaker as someone who is not the author or the agent of the actions they perform. To the extent that the individual agency of the speaker does become apparent when performance slips, the ancestral origins and thus effectiveness of his speech are in doubt. This model of language embodies a broader set of assumptions about the nature of authority and the practices of power. In the case of Sambanese ritual speech, the signs of power are conceived to be generated by a source that remains distinct from the bodily individuals who wield them. It is part of the formal character of that speech to make that conception persuasive and available to the experience of both listeners and speakers. At the same time, this conception of power shapes the formal character of speech and forges it into the most effective means of acting in a world of invisible agents. This view of language stands in contrast to certain elements of pervasive common sense Western understanding of how language works, sometimes called language ideology. The debate over speech practices in Sumba involves two aspects of Western language ideology, in particular, namely the central role it accords speakers' intentions and the kinds of functions it understands language to serve. The first of these, the intentionalistic model, was expressed at least as early as St. Augustine. An important modern formulation of the place of intentions in meaning was given by the philosopher Grace. In this view, linguistic signs work by virtue of the speaker's intention to communicate and by virtue of their being understood by the hearer to reflect such an intention. That is, for you properly to communicate with me. That is, for you properly to communicate with me, I must impute to you not only an intention to communicate to me, but also an intention to get me to recognize that intention. By implication, then, my communicative act is mediated by the recipient's underlying assumptions about language. But as will become apparent, Symbionese and many other ethnographic counterexamples suggest that, by privileging individual intentions, Grace has laid out a specifically Western language ideology. The second relevant aspect of Western language ideology provoked by Symbionese practices concerned language function. Several linguists have argued that speakers of European languages tend to see the normal function of language as reference and predication. This common-sense view of language stresses the capacity of language to point to things in the word, to speak about them in ways that are essentially true or false, and this view locates that ability in the semantics of individual words. But contrasting language ideologies exist, as pointed out some time ago, as Michel Rosaldo argued that the Ilongo of the northern Philippines see language first and foremost as a means of uttering directives. Implicit in the practices of Symbionese ritual speech are assumptions about how language works that differ markedly from the notion that it is primarily a medium for the making of propositions. Symbionese ritual speech is supposed to carry out efficacious actions. The contrast was well expressed by the missionary and linguist Lois Onvili, puzzling over how best to translate the Dutch word bidden, to pray. He wrote, "I think of the word with which we rendered or to pray, parangana, which literally means to make someone hear the word, direct the word to, a word that is indeed used in this sense in daily speech. But once I went along, when summoned for the killing of a chicken, one of the officiants was told to parangani li namanu, in other words, make the chicken hear the word, in order that by and by the chicken's intestines should then speak what the forefathers mean to say, to be able to serve as oracle." And in another context, regarding what was hot and thus ritually perilous and ought to be cooled, they said, Parangigya li ni wi, make the water heal the word, thus talk about the water so that it indeed shall be able to cool. And thus I am here in the neighborhood of the magical word, which confers corrosive power unto that over which the word is spoken. And now we use this word in another connection and say Parangani liim jori, to make the Lord heal the word. Shall this word continually be clear for those who hear it? Hear it. In this passage, Anvli accurately described a central component of somebody's ritual speech practice, that it has the formal structure of dialogue, and along with this, the implicit ideology that dialogue produces material effects. Anvli raised the problem with reference to the possibility of mistranslation. The mistranslation of to pray is important because of the way it leads irrevocably from speech practices to mistaken views of agency, of the kinds of beings that inhabit the word, and ultimately of the morality of certain ways of interacting with the divine. The mistranslation of to pray arises from distinct views of the purposive uses of language. The errors immanent in somebody's marapu prayer, according to the Anvli, are threefold. By addressing the chicken, marapu prayer treats as an agent that which ontologically lacks agency. In cooling that which is hot, it falsely attributes efficacy to words. Finally, it incites the speaker to coerce the listener. In doing so, marapu prayer tempts mere humans to lèse-majesté with respect to the spirit word and by implication, divinity. Language ideologies are linked to concepts of the speaking subject and the nature of action. It is for this reason that Protestant theology is scandalized by marapu ritual practices, not simply because they differ in their commitments to particular theories of language, but because of the wider implications, both ontological and moral. In the quotations to which I will not now turn, we can see that when Dutch Calvinists look at marapu prayer, they counterpose the sincerity of Christian prayer as expressions that arise from individual and internal sources against what they take to be a fetishistic displacement of agency onto objectified forms. This, by the way, is a two-way street. Marapu followers, in turn, attribute to the isolated speaker of Protestant prayer an excessive willfulness, a hubris that is at once dangerous and ineffective. Over the course of these debates, which accompany changes in speech practices, each group expresses distinct concepts of language, action, and the nature of speaking subject. Missionary practice is often shaped by the referential model of language function. The initial task of a proselytizing religion is, after all, to preach the gospel. For Dutch Calvinists, such preaching can work only by virtue of denotations. It must not seek to effect consequences directly, which would be magical. In its austerity and caution about syncretism, Calvinist preaching, whether undertaken by Dutch or Sumbonese Christians, does not even have recourse to the patience, as in the ecstasy of the evangelical camp meeting, or what the missionaries see as the seductions of Catholic ritual. Preaching can only convey true statements about the word and hope thereby to persuade. What are the implications of these contrasting language ideologies for their respective understandings of the speaking subject? In Protestant critique, idolaters, among whom they often include Catholics, confuse or conflate exterior and interior. This confusion underlies the terrible dread that is supposed to pervade heathen life, because all evil arises from agents external to the human subject. As Willenga explained, the characteristic oppression of the Marapu followers' religious spirit and soul veneration is fear. He feels himself away, surrounded with threats. To counteract this, Willenga continued, the preacher must explain that the human soul, the human's life principle, thus sits in the person. It is inner and visible. The wise creator has so placed the soul that there is no danger from external material things. This means that the sermonizer must present a model of interiority explicitly distinguished from the subject's investment in physical objects and other external agents. Against the external agents so feared by pagans, Protestants often counterpose sincere speech. For them, speech arises from within and is self-immaterial. It thus manifests the presence of the real spiritual locus of the individual will, something carried to one logical conclusion in the Quaker institution of silent meeting, which rejects all but the most spontaneous words as inauthentic. Much as pagan fetishism embodies a profound misunderstanding of what attributes properly belong to, and what can be hoped for, material objects, and what pertains to human subjects, so too with language. Thus, today, some of these Protestants insist on the importance of shutting one's eye while praying, something that continued to puzzle Marapu followers in some of our conversations in 1993. As one man asked me, what are they afraid of? Answering his own question sardonically, maybe they're afraid their sins are visible. What is at stake for somebody's Calvinists? A church warden explained to me that you close your eyes so that your speech will come from the heart. He contrasted this to Catholics who must keep their eyes open in order to read the prayer book. Pointedly, he compared them to Marapu followers, adding that Catholic practices verge on idolatry with their statues of the Virgin. Note that, by including Catholicism in his remarks, he was making an explicit association between the fetishizing displacement of idol worship and that of reciting the written word. Another person put it to me this way. As for Marapu followers, they don't even pay attention during the prayers, as long as they have their priests do their job for them. They don't concentrate as we do, but just chat away. In a sermon I recorded, the minister drew on some of Calvinism's other rivals to characterize sincere prayer, saying, yes, as for Catholicism, there are often formulae. Can't skip over or go contrary to the way of praying. Have to follow exactly. Like in Islam, for example. It has to be so many times. We, on the other hand, are not taught like this. It's not enough just 5 times. If we breathe, we don't just do it 5 times. Breathing goes on, doesn't it? Notice here the rhetorical effects of the image of breath. This image denies the discreteness of the act of speaking and assimilates it to other constant bodily processes. Constant rather than framed, ordinary rather than elevated, intimate rather than detachable, The speech of Protestant faith is identified with the full presence of the everyday physical locus of the individuated subject. This view of formulae expresses another aspect implicit in Onvli's criticism of Marapu prayer, to make someone hear the word, which I quoted above. It concerns the meaning of lihi, word, which denotes both the couplets used in ritual speech, and by metonymy, the original commitment between the ancestors and their descendants. The couplets are spoken in rites that fulfill the commitment, and in principle, the less those couplets deviate from the original words of the ancestors, the better the fulfillment. The authority of any given performance rests precisely in the fact that the words do not originate with the speaker, nor do they display themselves as conveying a set of propositions. As the minister's comments about the idolatry of the Virgin suggest, Calvinist criticisms of inauthentic prayer view it as similar to the fetishized object. Like the spirits it addresses, it stands outside the subject, and to it the subject surrenders the real capacity to act. By contrast, authentic speech must originate within the speaker, guided by intentions and referring to a word beyond itself. Onvli insisted that the Church must be careful not to destroy the moral fabric of society by dismantling its ritual practices. Instead, the forms of these practices should be preserved, but their performative effects reframed to strengthen their voluntaristic yet disinterested character. For example, the feast could be reinterpreted, in Onvli's word, as no longer a necessity but a gift, not in order to influence but to thank, not supacha but sebab. Notice three things about this brief quotation. First, agency is restored to humans who previously had been in thrall to ancestral mandates. Second, the ritual activity that results in itself is itself no longer agentive in any strong sense. It has lost its place in a word of causation and been reconfigured as a form of expression that refers to other sides of action. And third, even material practices such as the slaughtering of animals, distribution of meat, cooking, and commensuality turn out to be displaced forms of speech, so many ways of saying thank you. Thanks come after the fact, referring to outcomes brought about only by the speaker's bodily efforts and the autonomous workings of God. By insistently denying the powers of words, Calvinists thereby affirm that humans are endowed with a free will and are thus liberated from the tyranny of fetishes and capricious spirits. In the process, of course, Calvinists also deny the agency of those Marapu followers for whom the words are a source of, or point of access to, power. Language and its temptation. To this point, the missionaries and their converts tell us a familiar story. The progress of salvation is one of growing self-recognition as humans cast off their attachment to false external idols. In the process, they come to recognize their existing inner resources and capacities for self-transformation, which allows them actively to develop the individual conscious. This story ultimately pertains not only to Protestant conversion, it supports a common narrative of modernity as a process of increasing individualization, interiorization, and by many accounts, even eventual secularization. But there is a complication to this narrative. This can be seen in another debate between Marapu followers and Calvinists. In the eyes of missionaries, pagans manifest a double error, a confusion between the agency proper to humans and that proper to divinity. The Marapu followers' view of human beings imputes to them both too much and too little agency. On the one hand, according to Willenga, the human ego is thus the center of his religion, because the pagan wants ritual to bring about material benefits. On the other hand, such is the pagan's fatalism. Willenga continued that the greatest stumbling block in the path of personal consciousness of sin is that he denies his human responsibility. That deprives him of all personal sense of guilt. He is firmly certain that he has come into the world with all his virtues and all his vices. These a man cannot alter. Within the spirit world itself, a similar confusion about agency can be found. Somebodies attribute too little agency to the deity and too much to the ancestors. According to Willenga, a highest being that has created all exists only in faint recollection. A man on earth takes no account of him. High above the clouds he sits enthroned in inaccessible distance. The agency possessed by the ancestors deprives both humans and God of that which is properly theirs. Therefore, Willenga proposed that the preacher tell them, before anything else, that it's not evil arbitrariness and angry envy of the spirits that determine men's lot, but the almighty and all-omnipresent power of God, such that leaves and grass, rain and drought, fruitful and unfruitful years, food and drink, health and illness, wealth and poverty, and all things come to us not by chance, but from his fatherly hand. This distinction among kinds of agency means that the Protestant subject provides an ambivalent origin for actions. In addition to the human interior, there is another locus of agency, namely God, along with the mediator, Christ. The story of creation and the insistence on the continuing activity of the Lord in the contemporary world impose a critical limit on the extent of human agency. In this respect, Protestants are more like their Marapu interlocutors than like their own more materialist contemporaries in early 20th century Europe. The presence of a transcendental subject affects even beliefs about the nature of language. Despite the centrality of individual intentions and authenticity in Protestant language ideology, or indeed as an historical and logical precondition for that centrality, there is an important qualification for language is in some ways exterior to its speaker. Therefore, however much one might wish to find in words the true locus of the spirit, language cannot entirely guarantee the autonomy of the subject. This is due to its material embodiment in sounds or writing and its social character. Words have some degree of existence outside both the speaker and listener. After all, since we hear ourselves speak, our words once uttered come to us as much as the words of others. Our words also come to us from other ontogenically. We learn a language that exists prior to our own utterances. In speaking, we display the extent to which others have entered into our own words. These aspects of language thus can seem to pose obstacles to sincere prayer, if, as in many Protestant views, it is defined by its origin in the individual subject. If we could guarantee the divinity of those words, this might not present a problem for religious practice. But to the extent that language is social in origin, it reveals, at least potentially, the incipient insincerity that threatens to intervene between speaker and the divine addressee. Although the Dutch Calvinists did not take their concern about this problem to the extremes of groups such as the Quakers or Pentecostals, they did demand that worship be spontaneous enough to forego the use of written prayer. Yet at the heart of their faith remained one overwhelmingly ulterior source of words, the Holy Gospel. In 1957, Lee offered the following reflections on a lifetime of linguistic research and Bible translation. After our return from Indonesia, someone asked me to speak about how you translate a Bible. To this I answered, "You do not do that. I do not do that. We do not do that. Human beings do not do that." Yes, indeed, men are really occupied with it, and human activity is really involved in it. Languages must be investigated and known, as far as this is possible. But text and understanding must be established, and there must be translation from one language to another. And that all ought to occur in responsible ways. Linguistics and philology and exegesis ought necessarily to contribute, and not only these, but to translate the Bible. It is with this as with all work in God's kingdom, and good understanding will say this with all our work. One investigates and explains, and the other is occupied in translating, but God translates the Bible. The language of the Bible, of course, is different from the authentic speech of the person who prays, as Lee went on to observe. What, now, can men say in words? All that which is one way or another falls in the circle of our thoughts and our experience. But what was spoken here has arisen in no man's heart. How can human language be the bearer thereof? Only reflections suggest that in at least one respect, biblical language resembles that of somebody's ritual speech. Its authority lies precisely in the fact that it does not derive from living speakers, and they are not its authors. They are, that is, the agent of a principle. They give voice to words that must be understood to derive from a source that lies beyond experience. The existence of words that emanate from a distant, divine source opens up a possibility on which many somebodies seize immediately, that the Christian's book itself could be fetishized as a site of or access point for agency that lies beyond the human subject. Lee recalled, "On a certain day, one of our acquaintances came running into us, asking if we could look in the book for him. On inquiry, it appeared that his son was working in the government office in the administrative center of Wangapu, thus outside the sphere of somebody's life. Now he had received news that his son was sick, and so would like to know if he would recover, and what should be done to bring it about. Therefore he asked us to look in the book. He had thus assimilated the word zorata, letter or book, to a related word of his, urata, which means line, also the line of the hand and the line in chicken entrail or pig liver, which is inspected and communicated with the dead in the spirit divination, from which one can know the word and wishes the dead." According to Lee, the man's confusion here was twofold. He was self-interested where he should be otherworldly, and he misconstrued the functions of language and thus the nature of material signs. The anxious father here sought from the Bible not statements about the truth of the word, but directives for efficacious action. Some 5 decades after the colonial period of Lee's recollections, the authority of Scripture and by extension of the written word, more generally, remains a central concern for Sudanese, both Christian and Marapu. Some Sudanese seize on the centrality of writing in the Protestant Church to justify their reluctance to convert, explaining that, being unable to read, they must remain Marapu. Although many Sudanese take the lack of a scripture as one defining feature of Marapu ritual, others seek to ground their authority in alternative forms of writing. Like the father in Henri's anecdote, many people today identify the divinatory reading of intestines as the Sudanese book. Others claim for themselves an equivalent to the authority of the book, some Marapu ritualists asserting that their knowledge too is a form of writing. For example, to gloss the expression, there is the ancestral track. One told me that this means it's like we take a piece of paper, then put down lines that is right, we give our performance direction. Still, others directly resist the authority of the written word. A recalcitrant Marapu follower, complaining of the aggressive efforts of young local evangelists, told me, "How I surprise them! When the proselytizers come to my house and open that book to read me, I tell them to listen first. Then I tell them what I know about the origins and Babel." Yet another priest said, "But those Christians, all they have is a book. This book can be destroyed, or again its handiwork can fade." In contrast, Marapu followers argue that they have a more secure evidential base for their line links to the ancestors, golden tombs that remain to this day, and that these links parallel those along which ancestral words have been transmitted. The lack of an ancestral book does not prevent Sudanese from trying to take advantage of the powers latent in books as sources of words exterior to the speaker. Some, for example, use the Bible as a tool of divination. In this, Sudanese are simply discovering a possibility that the authority and materiality of the written divine word seem always to have contained. Keith Thomas, for example, reminds us that throughout the Middle Ages and into the Reformation, any prayer or piece of the scriptures might have a mystical power waiting to be tapped. The Bible could be an instrument of divination, which opened at random would guarantee one's fate. On the one hand, such divination is simply an appeal to a source of words whose authority is superior to that of ordinary humans. But this use of the Bible participates in a more general characteristic of divination, which, as the linguist John Dubois has argued, constructs aleatory mechanisms precisely in order to suppress the existing intentionality of persons. Thus, the appeal to a non-human source of word acts to efface or momentarily bracket human agency. As I have suggested above, this is the active mode of one side of the discourse of fetishism. To ascribe agency to one locus is simultaneously to deny it to another. In using the Bible for divination, Sudanese seem to mobilize the latent possibilities afforded by the very distance of the Calvinist divine agent, as if they seek agency but not exactly to claim it for themselves. Conclusion. Dutch Calvinist in Sumba counterpose the sincerity of expressions arising from individual and internal sources against what they take to be Marapu rituals' fetishistic displacement of agency onto objectified verbal formula. For them, a mistaken view of language is inseparable from a mistaken understanding of the human object. Of particular concern to them are wrong speech that form an obstacle on the way to achieving an interior state of grace. As Willinger writes, whenever one has a bad understanding of redemption, then it is also a given that one has bad understanding of thankfulness. He shall answer the question, How shall I be thankful to God for such redemption? Thank and love God. Words and nothing but words. And it turns out that the thankfulness stands in acknowledging that he says thanks. Only seldom shall he convert it into a deed, both saying and doing. I am your servant, and will do work for you. His heathen religion has cost him much, many pecuniary and material sacrifices. In Marapu ritual, a removal of guilt must be purchased, for all must be paid for. But a Christian asks forgiveness, receives it, and says his thankfulness. The lack of interiority is mutually implicated with the misuse of words. If words are deeds, a view Willinga imputes to Marapu followers, they should be sufficient in themselves. But if words are only supplementary to deeds, something closer to Willinga's own view, they lie external to the subject, and so in themselves remain unbound to the subject's condition and acts. Inauthentic speech is then inseparable from materialism, going hand in hand with the corruption that conflates economic exchange with spiritual effects, forgiveness. Willinga's view of speech, in its very appeal to interiority, recognizes the ambiguously external character of language, which needs some additional resources if it is to be bound to inner states and outer works. But both sides in the encounter between Christians and Marapu followers find the other to be in error. Dwelling on different loci of agency, Christian and Marapu followers alike accuse each other of willfulness and lack of deference to the word of invisible beings. Thus, for their part, Marapu followers frequently accuse Christians of hubris in seeking to address the deity directly. Marapu followers see their ritual forms in contrast to the direct address to which Protestant prayer aspires, not as insincere, but as deferential. The performers insist that the words they utter are not their own, and that they dare address only intermediary spirits, not the ultimate powers. In this light, Marapu followers commonly attribute to the idolated speaker of Christian prayer an excessive willfulness that is at once dangerous and ineffective. According to these critics, it's precisely the Christian's refusal to attribute the warrants claimed by the speaking subject to the exteriority provided by language that renders them suspect. That is, through its efforts at sincerity and spontaneity, Christian prayer seems to deny that language and its powers originate beyond the individual speaker. To Marapu followers, this means an illegitimate transfer of responsibility from the invisible world of spirits to the fleshy domain of the living. Looking at the individual assertiveness embodied in Christian practices, Marapu followers are unimpressed by doctrinal claims of respect for the Lord. Conversely, attending to the diluted character of fetishism, colonial missionaries were similarly unimpressed by Marapu followers' understanding of agency, and overlooked the persuasiveness, authority, and delicate nature of ritual couplets. To be sure, there's a predictable cultural and political clash going on there, but I suggest there is something else involved as well. Both sides have to contend with the lingering doubt. For Marapu followers, it's all about the presence of the invisible spirits. For Christians, the presence of sincere intentions is the worshipper. What both sides share is that neither, in practice, treats the subject as fully autonomous and self-present. The potential for dispute or confusion about the locus of agency and the authorship of words is perhaps inescapable. The Protestant mission seeks to fix and stabilize the agency and authorship that most matter, distributing them between the interiority of speaking subjects and the distant site occupied by God. The Protestant genealogy of the version of authenticity and agency I have sketched here suggests that those who use these words should be alert to the assumptions they bear. Both Marapu followers and missionaries share a fundamental understanding of authority. Its human bearers should not be known or even know themselves to be the ultimate sources of agency. This authority is most legitimate, persuasive, and efficacious when the agency it manifests seems most to arise from somewhere else. What worries Marapu followers and Protestants about each other is not entirely that the other displaces agency away from living human beings. Rather, it is that the non-human site at which they find agency is the wrong one. The discourse on fetishism, whether theological, Marxist, or Freudian, harbors a promise of liberation linked to self-consciousness. As part of a broader concern for agency, it is especially evident in the current anthropological reworkings of Marx's assertion that human beings make themselves, even if not under conditions of their own choosing. But however fundamental their differences, Marapu and Calvinist discourse coincide at one critical point. Neither accepts the proposition that human beings simply make themselves, and both impose significant limits on human agency, locating it not just in Marx's dead weight of the past, but with other non-human agents altogether. Indeed, both Calvinist and Marapu followers might doubt any vision of fully self-present agency, freed altogether from the possibility of what others might describe as fetishism. Indeed, if we take seriously the way in which the actions of subjects are mediated by objective forms like those of speech, we might ask whether anyone's practices could altogether escape some form of charge of fetishism. This is part of the puzzle for the well-intentioned interlocutor. If the agency of others is predicated in part on their own beliefs and on the notions of agency immanent in their practices, how are we, if we are secular scholars, to reconcile their attribution of agency to divine subjects with our desire that they recognize that agency lies within their own hands? And, to the extent that the value Western scholar place on self-transformation is itself a product of our own genealogy, what does it mean for us to insist on the self-transforming powers of others? As we seek to grant agency to historical subjects, we might ask ourselves not only what agency is, and where to find it, but under what terms, and with what entailments it must be accepted.